The morning mist clung to the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains like the breath of sleeping giants, thick enough to swallow a man whole and spit out nothing but whispers. March 15th, 1920 would be remembered as the day the outside world first learned that some parts of America still harbored secrets older than the Constitution, deadlier than any war, and more unforgiving than the mountain winters that claimed a dozen lives each year. But before we dive into the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. James Big Jim Crawford stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn leather boots, a towering figure among the Virginia logging crews that had come to harvest the ancient timber from what they believed were empty mountain hollows. At 42 years old, Crawford had spent 20 years cutting his way through forests from Georgia to Pennsylvania, and he'd never encountered terrain that couldn't be conquered with determination, modern equipment, and the kind of industrial efficiency that was transforming America's wilderness into profit. His crew of 18 men represented the finest loggers money could hire, experienced woodsmen who could drop a 100-year-old oak exactly where they wanted it, skilled operators who could maneuver steam-powered equipment through terrain that would challenge mountain goats, and tough laborers who could work 14-hour days in conditions that would break city men in half. They'd arrived in the remote valleys of southwestern Virginia with contracts to harvest enough timber to supply 3 furniture factories and a railroad expansion project. The Shenandoah Lumber Company had purchased logging rights to 40,000 acres of what appeared to be pristine wilderness, inhabited only by the occasional mountain family who scratched out subsistence livings from soil too rocky for serious farming. Company surveyors had mapped the territory, identified the most valuable stands of timber, and planned access roads that would allow efficient extraction of logs worth more than most mountain families would see in a lifetime. But Crawford's crew was about to discover that some wilderness wasn't as empty as corporate maps suggested, and some mountain hollows harbored residents who'd been avoiding contact with the outside world for reasons that went far beyond simple preference for isolation. The first sign of trouble appeared on the morning of March 12th, when Crawford's advance scouting party returned from a 3-day reconnaissance mission with reports that didn't match their topographical maps. Tommy Jenkins, Crawford's most experienced scout, stood beside the main camp's cooking fire with the bewildered expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about familiar work had just been challenged. "Boss," Jenkins said, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to explain something he didn't understand. "We found clearings that aren't on any map, structures that don't match any building techniques I've ever seen, and signs of human activity in areas that are supposed to be completely uninhabited." Crawford studied the maps that had guided his operations throughout Appalachian logging campaigns, searching for explanations that would make sense of his scout's report. Corporate surveyors used the latest techniques. Government cartographers maintained detailed records of every significant geographical feature, and local county officials provided information about any families or settlements that might complicate logging operations. "What kind of structures?" Crawford asked, though his tone suggested he expected explanations that would resolve the apparent discrepancy between official records and field observations. Jenkins consulted notes that had been scrawled on paper that looked like it had been handled by nervous hands. "Low buildings, maybe 4 feet high, built into hillsides so they're almost invisible until you're right on top of them. Constructed from fitted stone without mortar, roofed with materials I couldn't identify. And the clearings." Jenkins paused, apparently struggling to describe what he'd observed. "The clearings are arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate planning, but the crops are varieties I don't recognize." The information didn't match anything in Crawford's 20 years of experience with Appalachian logging operations. Mountain families usually built conventional cabins using traditional construction techniques, planted familiar crops suited to local growing conditions, and lived in settlements that appeared on county records maintained by local governments. Bill Morrison, Crawford's equipment foreman, joined the conversation with additional observations that deepened the mystery. "Jim, we've been finding tool marks on trees that don't match any cutting implements our boys carry. Precise cuts, made with implements that slice through hardwood like butter, but leaving marks that suggest tools designed for people much shorter than normal height." Crawford felt the first stirring of unease that would grow into genuine concern over the following days. In 2 decades of logging operations, he'd encountered mountain families who were suspicious of outsiders, government agents who questioned corporate land rights, and environmental conditions that challenged even experienced crews, But he'd never faced situations where basic assumptions about terrain and population proved completely inaccurate. Any actual contact with whoever's making these tool marks? Crawford asked. Morrison shook his head, though his expression suggested he'd been hoping for such contact to clarify the situation. That's the strange part, Jim. We found evidence of recent human activity everywhere we've scouted, but we haven't seen a single person. Whoever's living in these mountains knows we're here, but they're staying completely out of sight. The crew spent the evening discussing potential explanations for the discrepancies between their maps and field observations. Some suggested that local mountain families had developed unusual building techniques adapted to local conditions. Others proposed that government surveyors had simply missed isolated settlements that preferred to avoid official attention. A few wondered whether they'd encountered the remnants of communities that had been deliberately excluded from official records for reasons related to taxation or law enforcement. But Crawford's instincts, sharpened by 20 years of working in territories where industrial operations intersected with local communities, suggested they might be facing something more complicated than simple mapping errors or administrative oversights. The precision of the tool marks Morrison described suggested inhabitants with sophisticated skills and equipment that didn't match typical mountain subsistence farming. The morning of March 13th brought the first direct evidence that Crawford's crew was being systematically observed by people who possessed intimate knowledge of their activities. Pete Wilson, one of Crawford's most reliable equipment operators, reported that his steam-powered saw had been tampered with during the night, modified in ways that demonstrated both mechanical expertise and deliberate intention to disrupt logging operations. Somebody knows exactly how these machines work, Wilson explained, pointing to alterations that would have been impossible for amateurs to accomplish. They didn't damage anything permanently, but they adjusted the timing mechanisms in ways that would cause equipment failures under load. Professional sabotage designed to look like mechanical problems. Crawford examined the modifications with growing concern. Industrial sabotage wasn't uncommon when logging operations encountered local resistance, but the technical sophistication Wilson described suggested opponents who possessed mechanical knowledge that exceeded what corporate security assessments had identified as potential threats. More disturbing was the evidence that whoever had tampered with the equipment had approached the heavily guarded camp without being detected by sentries who'd been specifically instructed to watch for unauthorized intrusion. Crawford's crew included military veterans who understood perimeter security, and they'd established watch rotations designed to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration that had apparently occurred. Any sign of how they got past our security? Crawford asked his night watch supervisor, a former Army sergeant named Dale Morrison, who'd served in France during the recent war. Morrison's expression carried the professional embarrassment of someone whose expertise had been neutralized by opponents he didn't understand. Jim, I've been thinking about that all morning. Our perimeter was secure, our watch rotations were professional, and our sentries were alert. But somehow, people who know our equipment better than we do got close enough to conduct detailed sabotage without triggering any alarms. The implications suggested that Crawford's crew was dealing with opponents who possessed both technical sophistication and tactical capabilities that exceeded their defensive preparations. Corporate security briefings had prepared them for resistance from mountain families who might object to logging operations, but not for organized opposition with the skills necessary to conduct covert operations against industrial equipment. Crawford's unease intensified on March 14th, when his logging crews began encountering evidence of coordinated surveillance that suggested their every movement was being monitored by people who remained completely invisible. Equipment that had been positioned according to standard logging protocols was found rearranged in ways that didn't prevent operations but demonstrated that someone had unlimited access to their work sites. More unsettling were the personal items that began disappearing and reappearing in locations that suggested the missing objects had been examined, studied, and returned with modifications that served no apparent purpose except psychological intimidation. Tools were sharpened to edges that exceeded factory specifications. Personal belongings were repositioned in patterns that created the impression of deliberate organization by unknown hands. Even food supplies were affected, with meals prepared according to recipes that incorporated ingredients no one in Crawford's crew recognized. "Boss?" Tommy Jenkins reported during the evening meal, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose professional confidence had been systematically undermined. "Whoever's watching us knows everything about our operations, our equipment, and our individual habits. They're not trying to drive us away. They're studying us. Crawford nodded grimly, understanding that his crew was facing psychological pressure designed to demonstrate their vulnerability to opponents who controlled every aspect of the tactical situation. In his experience with industrial operations that encountered local resistance, intimidation usually involved direct confrontation or obvious property destruction. The sophisticated psychological warfare his crew was experiencing suggested opponents with knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything corporate security assessments had prepared him to handle. The evening of March 14th brought the first actual contact with the people who'd been conducting surveillance and sabotage operations against Crawford's logging crew. But the contact came in a form that challenged every assumption the loggers had made about who they might be dealing with in the remote mountain hollows of southwestern Virginia. As Crawford's crew gathered around their cooking fire to discuss the day's increasingly disturbing developments, the forest around their camp fell into the kind of unnatural silence that preceded significant events. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, equipment operators paused in their maintenance routines, and every man turned his attention towards something they could sense but not identify. From the darkness beyond their fire's illumination, a voice emerged with the clear authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The words were English, but spoken with an accent that suggested linguistic traditions older than anything Crawford's crew had encountered in their travels throughout Appalachian America. "Men who cut the ancient trees," the voice announced, its tone carrying neither hostility nor welcome, but something that might have been curiosity mixed with warning. "You work in valleys that belong to people whose families have lived here since before your ancestors crossed the Great Water." Crawford stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept beside his bedroll, though something in the voice's calm authority suggested that weapons would be useless in the current situation. "Who's speaking?" he called toward the darkness. "We're legitimate contractors with legal rights to harvest timber in this area." The response carried the patient amusement of someone explaining obvious facts to confused children. Legal rights granted by governments that never asked permission from families who were here first. Your papers mean nothing to people who recognize older laws and different authorities. Around the fire, Crawford's crew shifted nervously as they began to understand they were facing something beyond their experience with typical mountain families. The voice spoke with the educated precision of someone familiar with legal concepts and government procedures, but it also carried implications of alternative authority that operated outside systems the loggers understood. "What do you want?" Crawford asked, his tone attempting to balance firmness with the diplomacy that sometimes resolved conflicts with local communities who objected to industrial operations. The answer would haunt Crawford's crew for the rest of their lives, however long those lives might prove to be in mountain territory controlled by people whose existence had never appeared on any government map or corporate survey. "We want you to understand," the voice replied, its words carrying the finality of someone announcing decisions that couldn't be appealed. "That some forests are guarded by traditions older than your industry, and some trees are protected by people who remember when this land was wild and free." The voice faded back into forest darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself, leaving Crawford's crew alone with their fire and the growing certainty that they'd just received a warning from opponents who possessed capabilities that exceeded anything their industrial experience had prepared them to handle. Crawford spent the sleepless night studying maps that had suddenly become useless, examining equipment that had been compromised by invisible opponents, and trying to develop strategies for dealing with resistance that operated according to rules no corporate manual had ever addressed. By morning, he understood that his logging operation had encountered something that would either end in negotiated withdrawal or escalate into conflict with people who'd been preparing for such confrontations far longer than the Shenandoah Lumber Company had been planning timber extraction in the ancient mountains of southwestern Virginia. The forest was waking up around them, but Crawford's crew was beginning to understand that they might be the ones who'd been sleeping, unaware that some wilderness still harbored secrets that industrial progress hadn't discovered and authorities that corporate power couldn't overcome. The dawn of March 15th, 1920, broke cold and gray over the Virginia mountains, but James Crawford barely noticed the weather as he studied the faces of his 18-man crew gathered around their breakfast fire. In 24 hours, his experienced loggers had transformed from confident industrial workers into nervous men who jumped at forest sounds and checked their weapons more often than their equipment. "Boss," Dale Morrison said quietly, his military bearing unable to disguise the concern in his voice. "The boys are spooked. Half of them want to pack up and head back to civilization before this gets any worse. Crawford understood his foreman's assessment, but corporate contracts and professional reputation created obligations that couldn't be abandoned because of mysterious voices and psychological intimidation. The Shenandoah Lumber Company had invested significant capital in equipment, transportation, and advance payments that would be forfeited if the operation was terminated without harvesting the contracted timber volume. "We're not running from mountain folk who play games in the dark," Crawford announced to his assembled crew, his voice carrying the authority that had sustained his leadership through 20 years of challenging operations. "We've got legal contracts, modern equipment, and enough firepower to handle any trouble that comes our way." But even as Crawford spoke, he felt the weight of uncertainty that came from facing opponents whose capabilities and intentions remained completely unknown. The voice from the forest had demonstrated knowledge of legal concepts and government procedures that suggested education and sophistication that didn't match typical mountain family characteristics. The systematic surveillance and equipment tampering indicated technical expertise that exceeded what isolated communities usually possessed. Tommy Jenkins raised the concern that had been troubling the entire crew since their encounter with the mysterious voice. "Jim, what if these aren't just mountain families who object to logging? What if we've stumbled into something bigger than local resistance to industrial operations?" Crawford had been considering the same possibility throughout his sleepless night. Corporate intelligence briefings had identified potential opposition from environmental groups, local communities, and government agencies that might question logging rights in sensitive areas. But they'd received no warnings about organized resistance with the capabilities his crew had encountered over the past 3 days. "Whatever we're dealing with," Crawford replied, his tone attempting to project confidence he didn't entirely feel, "we stick to our mission. We came here to harvest timber and we're going to complete our contracts according to schedule." The decision to continue operations despite mounting evidence of sophisticated opposition would prove to be Crawford's first fatal mistake. His second mistake was assuming that industrial equipment and modern weapons provided adequate protection against opponents who'd been studying his crew's capabilities while remaining completely invisible themselves. Crawford's third and final mistake was underestimating the extent to which his logging operation had violated traditions that some people considered worth defending through methods that corporate security assessments had never anticipated. The morning's work began normally enough, with equipment operators starting their steam-powered saws and crews moving toward timber stands that had been marked for harvest according to standard logging protocols. Crawford positioned himself near the main cutting area, maintaining radio contact with security teams that had been instructed to watch for any sign of the mysterious mountain people who'd been conducting surveillance operations against his crew. For 2 hours, the work proceeded without incident. Ancient oaks fell according to precise calculations, equipment performed according to specifications, and Crawford began to feel that professional competence might overcome whatever psychological intimidation his crew had been experiencing. The morning sun burned away the mountain mist, revealing familiar forest terrain that seemed less threatening in daylight than it had appeared during the previous night's mysterious encounter. But the Telungi had been preparing their response with the patient, methodical precision of people who'd been defending their territory for generations against intruders who possessed superior technology but inferior knowledge of mountain warfare tactics. The attack began at 10:47 a.m. with a precision that demonstrated extensive planning and intimate knowledge of logging operations. Crawford's first indication that something had gone wrong was the sudden silence of equipment engines that had been running smoothly moments before, followed by shouts from crew members who discovered that their machinery had been systematically disabled through sabotage that exceeded anything they'd experienced during the previous days. "Boss," Pete Wilson's voice carried across the cutting area with the urgency of someone who'd just discovered that his professional assumptions had been completely wrong. "Every piece of equipment is down. Somebody's disabled the steam engines with techniques I've never seen before." Crawford rushed toward the equipment staging area, his mind racing through possibilities that might explain simultaneous mechanical failures across multiple machines that had been operating normally minutes earlier. But what he found exceeded his worst fears about the sophistication of opposition his crew was facing. The sabotage was surgical in its precision, demonstrating mechanical knowledge that exceeded the expertise of his own equipment operators. Steam pressure systems had been modified to prevent operation without causing obvious damage that would immediately alert operators to tampering. Fuel lines had been rerouted in ways that created systematic failures rather than dramatic explosions. Even the backup hand tools had been affected, sharpened to edges so fine they became dangerous to use, but modified so subtly that the changes weren't immediately obvious. How long to get the equipment running again? Crawford asked Wilson, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be problematic. Wilson's expression carried the professional frustration of someone whose expertise had been neutralized by opponents who understood his equipment better than he did. Jim, whoever did this knows these machines inside and out. They didn't just break things, they redesigned the mechanical systems according to principles I don't recognize. It could take days to figure out what they've done, and weeks to repair the modifications. The implications hit Crawford like a physical blow. Without functional equipment, his logging operation couldn't harvest the timber that justified their presence in the Virginia mountains. Corporate contracts included penalty clauses that would bankrupt the Shenandoah Lumber Company if delivery schedules weren't maintained. And returning to civilization with reports of mechanical sabotage by unknown mountain people would damage his professional reputation throughout the logging industry. But Crawford's immediate concerns about corporate contracts and professional standing were about to become irrelevant as the Telungi transitioned from psychological intimidation to direct action against intruders who'd ignored their warning about respecting ancient territories. The first casualty occurred at 11:23 a.m. when Tommy Jenkins disappeared while conducting reconnaissance near the equipment staging area. One moment he was examining sabotaged machinery with Wilson and two other crew members. The next moment he was gone, vanished so completely that the men working beside him didn't notice his absence until Crawford called for a head count to assess their tactical situation. "Where's Jenkins?" Crawford demanded, his voice carrying the edge that came from understanding that his crew was facing opponents who could eliminate experienced woodsmen without creating any disturbance that might alert their companions. Wilson and the other equipment operators looked around the staging area with the bewildered expressions of men whose fundamental assumptions about their own security had just been challenged. "He was right here 30 seconds ago, examining the steam engine modifications. I turned away to check the fuel lines, and when I looked back, he was gone." Crawford felt cold certainty settling in his chest as he realized that his crew wasn't just dealing with sophisticated sabotage and psychological intimidation. They were facing opponents who could eliminate his men one by one while remaining completely invisible themselves, using techniques that exceeded anything corporate security training had prepared them to handle. "Nobody works alone," Crawford ordered, his military instincts taking over from his corporate responsibilities. "Three-man teams maintain visual contact at all times, and everyone stays armed and alert for contact with hostiles we can't see or predict." But the Telungi had been refining their hunting techniques for generations, and Crawford's defensive measures were inadequate against opponents who possessed every tactical advantage that intimate terrain knowledge and patient preparation could provide. The second disappearance occurred at 12:15 p.m., when Bill Morrison and Steve Patterson vanished while conducting security sweeps of the perimeter area around the main camp. Unlike Jenkins' disappearance, which had occurred without any sound or disturbance, Morrison and Patterson's elimination was accompanied by brief sounds of struggle that carried across the forest before cutting off with an abruptness that suggested whatever had happened was over quickly. Crawford assembled his remaining 15 men around the cooking fire, their weapons ready and their nerves stretched to the breaking point by threats they couldn't identify or counter. In 20 years of logging operations, he'd never encountered opposition that could eliminate experienced workers with such systematic efficiency while remaining completely invisible to their targets. "Dale," Crawford said to his remaining foreman, a tough veteran who'd survived combat in France but looked shaken by the morning's events, "what's your assessment of our tactical situation?" Dale Morrison's military experience provided frank evaluation that confirmed Crawford's worst fears. "Jim, we're dealing with opponents who know this terrain better than we know our own equipment, who can move through forest without detection, and who can eliminate our people without giving us any opportunity for retaliation. We're not equipped for this kind of warfare." Crawford studied the faces of his remaining crew, seeing the strain of men who'd signed up for dangerous industrial work, but found themselves facing combat against enemies who possessed every advantage except superior firepower. But even their weapons might prove useless against opponents who could strike without warning and disappear without trace. The psychological pressure intensified throughout the afternoon, as Crawford's crew discovered evidence that their missing companions had been taken alive rather than killed outright. Personal belongings appeared at locations throughout their camp, arranged in patterns that suggested the missing men had been systematically searched and their possessions distributed according to purposes that remained unclear. More disturbing were the modifications made to equipment and supplies that indicated their captors possessed detailed knowledge of logging operations and modern industrial techniques. Food supplies were supplemented with provisions that improved nutritional value through methods none of Crawford's crew recognized. Weapons were maintained and improved through techniques that exceeded factory specifications. Even their medical supplies were enhanced with additions that suggested sophisticated understanding of wilderness healthcare. "They're not trying to drive us away," Dale Morrison observed as the crew examined evidence of their captors' activities throughout the camp. "They're studying us, learning everything about our equipment, our procedures, and our capabilities." Crawford nodded grimly, understanding that his logging operation had become a source of intelligence for opponents who were gathering information about industrial techniques and modern equipment through methods that combined direct observation with hands-on examination of captured personnel and their belongings. The evening brought Crawford's first direct visual contact with the people who'd been eliminating his crew with such systematic efficiency. But the encounter challenged every assumption he'd made about who might be responsible for the sophisticated resistance his operation had encountered in the remote Virginia mountains. As darkness settled over their defensive perimeter, Crawford became aware of movement in the forest around their camp that suggested the presence of numerous people positioning themselves for coordinated action. But when the first figures emerged from tree cover into the firelight, Crawford's fundamental understanding of the situation was transformed by observations that contradicted everything corporate intelligence had suggested about potential opposition to logging operations. The people approaching their camp were unlike any mountain families Crawford had encountered during 20 years of Appalachian logging. They stood barely 4 feet tall, but their movements carried the coordinated precision of people accustomed to working together in dangerous situations. Their clothing combined traditional materials with modifications that suggested both practical adaptation to mountain conditions and access to resources that isolated communities usually couldn't obtain. More striking was the equipment they carried, weapons that appeared to be handcrafted but incorporated design principles that exceeded anything Crawford's military veterans had seen during recent combat experience. Tools that combined traditional mountain implements with modifications that suggested understanding of mechanical principles that rural communities typically didn't possess. But most unsettling was the intelligence visible in their expressions. These weren't simple mountain folk who'd developed unusual customs through isolation from modern civilization. These were people whose knowledge and capabilities had been systematically underestimated by government surveys and corporate assessments that had failed to recognize their existence or understand their sophistication. The leader of the group that emerged from the forest carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the survival of entire communities. Despite his small stature, his presence dominated the tactical situation through sheer force of competence and confidence that came from intimate knowledge of terrain and circumstances that favored his people over any outside opposition. "James Crawford," the leader said, his voice carrying the same educated precision that had characterized the previous night's warning, "you have ignored our request to respect ancient territories. Your men have been taken to ensure they understand the consequences of violating traditions that have protected these mountains for longer than your government has existed." Crawford forced himself to maintain eye contact with someone whose physical appearance contradicted the tactical authority he obviously possessed. "What do you want with my crew?" The answer would define the remaining hours of Crawford's life and establish the reputation that would make the Telungi legendary among mountain communities throughout Appalachian America. "We want to educate them," the leader replied with calm certainty, "about the difference between legal rights and traditional authority, between modern equipment and ancient knowledge, and between corporate power and mountain justice." The forest around Crawford's camp filled with movement as more Telungi emerged from concealment, their numbers suggesting that his 15 remaining men were outnumbered by opponents who possessed every tactical advantage that terrain knowledge, coordinated planning, and generational preparation could provide. Crawford's hand moved toward his rifle, but the Telungi leader's expression suggested that resistance would only accelerate educational processes that had already been designed to address exactly the kind of opposition Crawford represented. The final lesson was about to begin, and Crawford's crew was about to discover why some mountains had remained unconquered despite centuries of attempts by outside authorities who possessed superior technology but inferior understanding of what they were truly facing in the ancient forests of Appalachian America. The morning of March 16, 1920, dawned with an unnatural stillness that even the mountain birds seemed to respect, as if nature itself understood that something ancient and terrible was about to unfold in the Virginia hollows. James Crawford woke to discover that his remaining 15 men had been reduced to 7 during the night, taken so quietly from their defensive perimeter that the sentries hadn't heard so much as a whisper of disturbance. The Telungi had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything Crawford's military experience had prepared him to comprehend. They moved through mountain terrain like smoke through trees, eliminated trained loggers without creating any sound of struggle, and left behind evidence of their presence that was simultaneously subtle and psychologically devastating. Crawford's remaining men huddled around their cooking fire with the hollow expressions of people whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been systematically destroyed over the course of 4 days. Dale Morrison, his last functioning foreman, maintained military bearing through pure force of will, but his hands shook as he cleaned a rifle that had proved useless against opponents who struck without warning and vanished without trace. "Boss," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to maintain leadership when leadership had become meaningless, "we've lost 11 men in 36 hours. Whatever these mountain people are, they're eliminating us faster than we can count our losses." Crawford studied topographical maps that had become worse than useless, marked with notations about terrain features that apparently didn't exist, and population centers that had never been accurately surveyed. The Shenandoah Lumber Company's intelligence about southwestern Virginia had proved so inadequate that continuing operations based on corporate assessments would be tantamount to suicide. "Any word from the missing men?" Crawford asked, though he suspected the answer would confirm his worst fears about what had happened to crew members who'd vanished during the Telungi's nocturnal hunting expeditions. Morrison shook his head, his expression carrying the grim certainty of someone who'd seen enough combat to recognize when tactical situations had deteriorated beyond salvage. "Nothing. No distress calls, no signs of struggle, no evidence of where they've been taken or what's happened to them. It's like they've been swallowed by the forest itself." But Crawford's immediate concerns about his missing crew were interrupted by intelligence that suggested the Telungi's educational process was more systematic and more terrifying than simple elimination of intruders who'd ignored warnings about respecting ancient territories. Pete Wilson, Crawford's last functioning equipment operator, returned from a reconnaissance mission with observations that transformed the morning's tactical assessment from desperate to hopeless. "Jim," Wilson reported, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to process information that contradicted everything he'd believed about mountain communities and their capabilities. "I found evidence of our missing boys." Crawford felt something cold settle in his chest as he prepared to receive news that would either provide hope for rescue operations or confirm that his crew had been eliminated by opponents whose methods exceeded anything corporate security training had prepared them to handle. "What kind of evidence?" Crawford asked, his voice carefully controlled to prevent his remaining men from detecting the despair that was beginning to overwhelm his determination to complete the logging operation according to corporate contracts and professional obligations. Wilson consulted notes that had been written in handwriting so unsteady it suggested the author had been struggling to maintain composure while recording observations that challenged his understanding of reality. "They're alive, Jim. All of them. But they're being held in some kind of underground facility that's more sophisticated than anything I've seen outside major cities." The information provided both relief and new fears about what the Telungi intended for captured logging crews. Corporate intelligence had suggested that resistance to industrial operations might involve property destruction, equipment sabotage, or direct confrontation with local communities who objected to environmental disruption. But systematic capture and detention suggested opponents with organizational capabilities that exceeded anything government surveys had identified in remote mountain areas. "How sophisticated are we talking about?" Morrison asked, his military background providing context for evaluating enemy capabilities that would determine whether rescue operations might be feasible or whether Crawford's remaining crew should focus on escape and survival. Wilson's answer eliminated any possibility that Crawford's situation could be resolved through conventional tactical thinking or corporate problem-solving techniques. Dale. They've built facilities that combine traditional mountain construction with engineering principles that exceed anything I've seen in 20 years of industrial work. Underground chambers carved from living rock, ventilation systems that provide perfect air circulation, and living areas that would be comfortable in major hotels. The description suggested that the Telungi possessed both the knowledge and the resources necessary to construct permanent installations capable of housing significant numbers of captives under conditions that prioritized long-term detention over simple elimination. Crawford's missing crew wasn't just being held prisoner. They were being subjected to educational processes that might continue indefinitely. But Wilson's reconnaissance had revealed information that was even more disturbing than evidence of sophisticated detention facilities. Jim, I saw some of our boys working alongside their captors. Not forced labor, not obvious coercion, but voluntary cooperation on projects I couldn't identify from a distance. Crawford felt his understanding of the tactical situation collapse as he absorbed implications that transformed the Telungi from simple opponents into something far more complex and potentially more dangerous. If captured loggers were cooperating with their captors, the situation had evolved beyond rescue operations into something that resembled conversion or indoctrination. What kind of projects? Crawford asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to understand what had happened to crew members who'd apparently chosen to work with people who'd eliminated their companions with such systematic efficiency. Wilson's response confirmed Crawford's worst suspicions about what the Telungi's educational process involved. Advanced mechanical work, Jim. Our boys were using their industrial knowledge to help improve equipment and construction techniques that were already more sophisticated than anything we brought to these mountains. The information suggested that the Telungi weren't just capturing intruders who violated ancient territories. They were systematically acquiring knowledge about modern industrial techniques through methods that combined detention with technical education that benefited both captors and captives. Crawford's radio crackled with transmission from his security team, interrupting strategic planning that was becoming increasingly irrelevant as the tactical situation deteriorated beyond any possibility of corporate resolution. Boss, we've got movement on all sides of the camp. Looks like they're positioning for some kind of coordinated action. Through his binoculars, Crawford could see evidence of Telungi forces establishing positions that suggested his remaining crew was completely surrounded by opponents who possessed every tactical advantage that terrain knowledge, numerical superiority, and generational preparation could provide. The defensive perimeter that had seemed adequate for protecting against typical mountain resistance had become a trap that eliminated any possibility of escape or effective retaliation. But the Telungi weren't preparing for violent assault against Crawford's remaining crew. Their positioning suggested something more sophisticated than simple elimination of intruders who'd ignored warnings about respecting traditional territories. The educational process that had begun with psychological intimidation and systematic capture was about to enter its final phase. At 11:30 a.m., the Telungi leader emerged from forest cover with the calm confidence of someone whose victory was so complete that dramatic gestures were unnecessary. Behind him, Crawford could see his missing crew members, alive and apparently unharmed, but carrying themselves with the subdued expressions of people whose fundamental understanding of reality had been permanently altered. James Crawford, the leader announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose power was derived from community consensus rather than corporate appointment. Your men have been learning about the difference between legal rights and traditional authority, between modern equipment and ancient knowledge, and between industrial efficiency and mountain wisdom. Crawford studied the faces of his crew members who'd been returned to him, searching for signs of coercion or abuse that might justify resistance to whatever the Telungi leader was proposing. But what he saw was more unsettling than evidence of physical mistreatment. His men showed the expressions of people who discovered that their previous assumptions about mountain communities and their capabilities had been completely wrong. Tommy Jenkins stepped forward from the group of returned crew members, his weathered face showing the strain of someone whose worldview had been systematically reconstructed over the course of 3 days in Telungi custody. Jim, Jenkins said quietly, his voice carrying conviction that seemed to come from genuine understanding rather than forced compliance. These people aren't what we thought they were. Crawford felt his authority as crew leader beginning to dissolve as he realized that his men's loyalty was being transferred to opponents who demonstrated superior knowledge of conditions that determined survival in mountain terrain that corporate maps had never accurately described. "What do you mean?" Crawford asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would challenge everything he'd believed about the tactical situation his logging operation had encountered in the remote Virginia mountains. Jenkins' response confirmed Crawford's fears about what had happened to crew members who'd been subjected to the Telungi's educational process. "They've been teaching us about this land, Jim, about how long they've been here, about what they've learned from generations of living in these mountains, and about why industrial logging operations threaten things that can't be replaced." The information suggested that the Telungi's resistance to Crawford's operation wasn't based on simple objection to environmental disruption or territorial violations. Their opposition was founded on knowledge systems that placed industrial efficiency in context with ecological relationships that corporate planning had never considered. Bill Morrison, Crawford's equipment foreman, joined Jenkins with observations that would redefine everything Crawford believed about mountain communities and their relationship to modern industrial development. "Boss, they've shown us construction techniques that are more efficient than anything we use, mechanical principles that exceed factory specifications, and agricultural methods that produce better results with less environmental damage." Crawford struggled to maintain his sense of authority and purpose, as his crew's reports systematically demolished the corporate assumptions that had guided their logging operation from its initial planning through its current tactical crisis. If the Telungi possessed superior knowledge of techniques that exceeded modern industrial standards, corporate contracts and professional obligations became meaningless in comparison to educational opportunities that might transform American industrial development. But Crawford's personal crisis of understanding was interrupted by the Telungi leader's final proposal, which would determine whether the logging operation could be resolved through negotiated withdrawal or would escalate into conflict that neither side could survive without devastating losses. "James Crawford," the leader said with the calm certainty of someone whose position was so strong that dramatic threats were unnecessary, "your corporate contracts assume authority over land that belongs to people whose families have lived here for centuries. Your industrial techniques assume that efficiency justifies environmental damage that affects communities your employers have never acknowledged." Crawford listened with growing understanding that he was facing opponents whose knowledge and capabilities had been systematically underestimated by corporate intelligence that had failed to recognize either their existence or their sophistication. "What do you propose?" Crawford asked, his voice carrying the resignation of someone whose assumptions about authority and capability had been completely overturned by encounters with realities that corporate planning had never anticipated. The Telungi leader's response would establish precedents that would influence industrial development throughout Appalachian America for the next century. "We propose education. Your men will learn about mountain knowledge that exceeds corporate techniques. We will learn about industrial methods that might serve community purposes without destroying traditional ways of life." Crawford looked around at his remaining crew, seeing faces that reflected growing understanding that they'd encountered something more valuable than corporate contracts or professional advancement. The Telungi weren't just offering to spare their lives. They were proposing to share knowledge that might transform American industrial development through integration with traditional techniques that had sustained mountain communities for generations. Dale Morrison stepped forward with the military bearing that had sustained him through combat in France, but had proved inadequate for dealing with opponents whose capabilities exceeded anything European warfare had prepared him to handle. "Sir," Morrison said to the Telungi leader, his tone carrying respect that came from recognition of superior tactical knowledge, "what guarantees do we have that this educational process won't simply eliminate us through methods we don't understand?" The leader's response demonstrated the confidence of someone whose authority was derived from community consensus, and whose power was based on knowledge that had been tested through generations of successful application to mountain conditions that challenged every assumption about survival and prosperity. "Your guarantee," the leader replied with calm certainty, "is that mountain communities survive through cooperation rather than elimination, through knowledge sharing rather than territorial conquest, and through integration rather than destruction of people who possess useful capabilities." Crawford felt the weight of decision that would either restore his crew to corporate employment or transform them into participants in cultural exchange that might influence American development for decades to come. The Shenandoah Lumber Company expected completion of contracts that would generate profit through forest destruction, but the Telungi were offering knowledge that might prove more valuable than any corporate compensation. How long would this educational process take? Crawford asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose corporate obligations were being overwhelmed by opportunities that exceeded anything his professional experience had prepared him to evaluate. The Telungi leader's answer carried implications that would transform not just Crawford's logging operation, but his understanding of what constituted valuable knowledge and worthwhile employment in mountain regions where traditional communities possessed capabilities that corporate planning had never recognized. Time enough, the leader said simply, for you to understand the difference between corporate efficiency and mountain wisdom, between legal authority and traditional knowledge, and between industrial profit and community prosperity. Crawford looked around at his crew, seeing faces that reflected understanding that they'd encountered something more significant than resistance to logging operations. They'd discovered a community whose knowledge and capabilities had been hidden from corporate awareness, but whose cooperation might transform American industrial development through integration with traditional techniques that had sustained mountain families for centuries. The decision Crawford made would either end his career in corporate logging or begin his education in mountain knowledge that exceeded anything Shenandoah Lumber Company shareholders had ever imagined possible in the remote hollows of southwestern Virginia. 3 months after James Crawford's logging crew had vanished into the Virginia mountains, the outside world began to understand that something unprecedented had occurred in territories that government maps claimed were sparsely populated by subsistence farmers and isolated mountain families. But the truth that emerged would challenge everything American industrial development had assumed about the capabilities of traditional communities and the value of knowledge systems that had operated outside corporate awareness for generations. Crawford himself emerged from the Telungi settlements on June 15, 1920, transformed from a corporate logging contractor into something that defied easy categorization. His appearance showed the effects of 3 months in mountain communities whose lifestyle combined traditional techniques with sophisticated knowledge that exceeded anything his industrial experience had prepared him to comprehend. But more significant than Crawford's physical transformation was the fundamental change in his understanding of what constituted valuable knowledge and worthwhile employment in regions where traditional communities had developed capabilities that corporate planning had systematically underestimated or completely ignored. The story Crawford told to government investigators, corporate executives, and academic researchers would reshape American understanding of Appalachian communities and their relationship to industrial development for the next century. But his account also raised questions about the extent to which official surveys and corporate intelligence had failed to recognize the existence of people whose knowledge and capabilities challenged basic assumptions about progress, efficiency, and the relationship between traditional communities and modern industrial civilization. They're not what anyone thinks they are, Crawford explained to a joint committee of federal investigators and Shenandoah Lumber Company executives who'd assembled in Beckley, West Virginia, to determine what had happened to his logging operation and his missing crew. The Telungi represent something that our corporate and government assessments never anticipated. Crawford's use of the name Telungi was the first official acknowledgement that the people who'd eliminated his logging operation possessed distinct cultural identity and organized community structure that differed significantly from typical mountain families who lived in the region. Government ethnographers had never documented any group matching Crawford's description, and corporate surveys had identified no population centers capable of supporting the kind of sophisticated opposition his crew had encountered. "What do you mean by not what anyone thinks?" asked Dr. Margaret Whitman, an anthropologist from the Smithsonian Institution who'd been summoned to evaluate Crawford's claims about discovering previously unknown communities in regions that had been studied extensively by academic researchers and government agencies. Crawford's response would provide the foundation for decades of scholarly debate about the extent to which American territorial surveys had missed entire populations, whose existence challenged official understanding of how traditional communities had developed in isolation from mainstream American civilization. The Telungi aren't primitive mountain folk who've been cut off from modern development, Crawford explained, his voice carrying the conviction of someone whose direct experience had overturned fundamental assumptions about cultural development and technological sophistication. They're the descendants of people who deliberately chose isolation because they developed knowledge systems that were more advanced than anything the outside world had achieved. The claim challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between isolation and technological development that had guided American expansion and industrial development since the colonial period. Academic theory suggested that communities cut off from mainstream civilization would develop primitive technologies and simple social structures, while contact with advanced societies would accelerate technological and cultural progress. But Crawford's account described communities that had achieved sophisticated technological capabilities through deliberate isolation from mainstream American development, using traditional techniques that had been refined through generations of experimentation and adaptation to specific environmental conditions. What kind of advanced knowledge are you talking about? Dr. Whitman asked, her academic skepticism evident in the tone of someone whose professional understanding of cultural development was being challenged by claims that contradicted established anthropological theory. Crawford consulted notes that he'd compiled during his 3 months among the Telungi, documentation that would become the primary source for subsequent academic and government investigations into communities whose existence had never appeared in official records. Agricultural techniques that produce higher yields with less environmental damage than anything corporate farming has achieved. Construction methods that create structures more durable than modern engineering, while using only materials available in local environments. Medical knowledge that combines traditional plant medicines with anatomical understanding that exceeds what most trained physicians possess. The description painted a picture of technological sophistication that had been achieved through integration of traditional knowledge with systematic experimentation and refinement over generations of community development. But Crawford's account also suggested that the Telungi's capabilities extended beyond technical expertise into organizational and social structures that enabled more effective community coordination than mainstream American society had achieved. James Morrison, a Shenandoah Lumber Company executive who'd been tasked with determining corporate liability for the failed logging operation, interrupted Crawford's presentation with questions that reflected corporate concern about the financial and legal implications of encountering organized resistance to industrial development in territories where such opposition hadn't been anticipated. "Mr. Crawford," Morrison said, his tone reflecting the mixture of skepticism and concern that characterized corporate response to reports that challenged established understanding of operational environments. "Are you claiming that your crew was captured and held by some kind of organized military force operating in United States territory without government knowledge or authorization?" Crawford's response revealed the complexity of trying to explain the Telungi's capabilities, using concepts and categories that had been developed to describe mainstream American communities and their relationship to government authority. "The Telungi aren't a military force in any conventional sense," Crawford replied. "They're a community that's developed defensive capabilities as part of their overall knowledge system. They don't recognize government authority because they predate the establishment of that authority in their territories." The explanation raised legal and political questions about the extent to which federal and state governments possessed legitimate authority over communities that had never consented to inclusion in American territorial systems, and whose existence had never been acknowledged in official surveys or census records. Dr. Whitman pressed for more specific information about Telungi social organization and technological capabilities that might provide academic context for understanding how such communities had developed and maintained their isolation from mainstream American civilization. "How many people are we talking about? What kind of settlements? What evidence do you have for these advanced capabilities you're describing?" Crawford's response would establish the foundation for subsequent research into communities whose existence challenged basic assumptions about American territorial development and the relationship between government authority and traditional communities that had maintained independence from mainstream political and economic systems. Conservative estimate would be 1,500 to 2,000 people, distributed among settlements that are completely invisible unless you know exactly where to look, Crawford explained. They've developed construction techniques that integrate their communities so completely with natural terrain that aerial surveys and conventional mapping techniques simply don't detect their presence. The information suggested that significant populations had maintained organized communities in territories that government agencies had classified as sparsely populated wilderness, using techniques that rendered their settlements invisible to observation methods that had been used to survey and map American territorial expansion for over a century. But Crawford's most startling revelation concerned the fate of his missing crew members and what their experience had revealed about the Telungi's approach to dealing with outside intrusions into territories they'd controlled for generations without official recognition or government interference. "Where are your men now?" Morrison asked, corporate concern evident in his voice as he contemplated the legal and financial implications of logging crew members who'd been captured by unauthorized communities operating in territories where Shenandoah Lumber Company possessed legal logging rights. Crawford's answer would transform corporate understanding of labor relations and community development in regions where traditional knowledge systems offered alternatives to industrial employment that might prove more attractive to workers than corporate compensation packages. They're still there, Crawford replied simply. All of them. They chose to stay because what they're learning from the Telungi represents opportunities that exceed anything corporate employment could offer them. The revelation that experienced industrial workers had voluntarily chosen to abandon corporate employment in favor of participation in traditional communities challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between modern industrial development and worker satisfaction that had guided American labor policy since the Civil War. Dr. Whitman understood immediately that Crawford's account, if accurate, described cultural and technological phenomena that would require complete reassessment of academic understanding of how traditional communities had developed in isolation from mainstream American civilization. Mr. Crawford, Dr. Whitman said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone whose professional field had just encountered discoveries that might revolutionize established academic theory, would the Telungi be willing to permit scholarly investigation of their communities and their knowledge systems? Crawford's response revealed the complexity of establishing contact between traditional communities that had deliberately maintained isolation and mainstream American institutions that possessed authority to conduct official investigations into populations that had never been officially acknowledged. That would depend, Crawford replied, on whether such investigations would respect Telungi authority over their own territories and whether academic research would serve community purposes rather than simply extracting knowledge for outside use without providing reciprocal benefits. The conditions Crawford described challenged established academic and government protocols for conducting research into American communities, which typically assumed that federal authority superseded local community preferences regarding outside investigation of their social organization and cultural practices. But Morrison's corporate concerns focused on more immediate issues related to Shenandoah Lumber Company's legal obligations and financial liability for logging operations that had encountered organized resistance in territories where such opposition hadn't been anticipated by corporate planning or government intelligence. What about our logging contracts? Morrison demanded. The Shenandoah Lumber Company has legal rights to harvest timber in those areas, and we've invested significant capital in equipment and advance payments that can't be recovered if operations are terminated due to local resistance. Crawford's response would establish precedents that would influence industrial development throughout Appalachian America for decades to come, as corporate legal departments struggled to determine the extent to which traditional community authority might supersede government-granted industrial rights in territories where indigenous populations had never consented to inclusion in American legal and political systems. The Telungi position, Crawford explained, is that corporate logging rights assume government authority over territories that were never legitimately acquired from communities that were living there first. They don't recognize the legal validity of contracts that grant permission to destroy forests that have been managed by their communities for centuries. The legal challenge went beyond simple property disputes into fundamental questions about the relationship between federal authority and traditional communities that had maintained independent control over territories that American expansion had claimed without negotiating with existing inhabitants or acknowledging their prior rights to lands that had sustained their communities for generations. Dr. Whitman realized that Crawford's account described not just the discovery of previously unknown communities, but the emergence of legal and political questions that would require governmental and academic institutions to reconsider basic assumptions about American territorial authority and the rights of traditional communities that had never been included in official political and legal systems. Mr. Crawford? Dr. Whitman asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose questions might determine government policy toward communities whose existence challenged established understanding of American territorial development. In your assessment, would peaceful coexistence be possible between Telungi communities and mainstream American industrial development? Crawford's answer would define relationships between traditional Appalachian communities and outside authorities for the next century, establishing principles that would influence everything from environmental protection to indigenous rights throughout regions where isolation had preserved knowledge systems that offered alternatives to mainstream American approaches to community development and resource management. Coexistence would require fundamental changes in how American industrial development approaches communities that possess knowledge and capabilities that might be more valuable than anything corporate extraction could provide. Crawford replied, "The Telungi aren't opposed to progress, they're opposed to destruction that masquerades as progress." The distinction Crawford drew between development that enhanced community capabilities and development that destroyed traditional knowledge systems would influence American environmental and cultural policy for decades, as government agencies and corporate interests struggled to balance industrial efficiency with respect for communities that had developed sustainable alternatives to mainstream American approaches to prosperity and technological advancement. But Crawford's final revelation would establish the Telungi's reputation throughout Appalachian America and ensure that their territories would remain protected from industrial intrusion for generations to come. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Crawford said, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose experience had taught him to respect capabilities that exceeded anything mainstream American institutions had anticipated. "The Telungi's knowledge and defensive capabilities extend far beyond what my crew encountered during our logging operation." Morrison leaned forward with the concerned attention of someone whose corporate responsibilities had been complicated by discoveries that exceeded anything Shenandoah Lumber Company planning had prepared him to handle. "What do you mean?" Crawford's response would ensure that the Telungi territories would be marked on corporate maps as areas to be avoided rather than developed, and that government agencies would approach the region with respect for traditional authority that superseded federal jurisdictional claims. "The Telungi communities we encountered represent only a small portion of traditional populations that have maintained organized resistance to outside intrusion throughout Appalachian America," Crawford explained. "They're part of a network of communities that have been coordinating their defensive capabilities for centuries, and they possess knowledge that could make industrial development in mountain regions impossible if they chose to use it systematically." The revelation that organized traditional communities possessed both the knowledge and the coordination necessary to challenge American industrial development throughout entire regions would influence government policy and corporate planning for decades, as mainstream institutions struggled to accommodate the existence of populations whose capabilities had been systematically underestimated by official surveys and academic research. Crawford's testimony would become the foundation for a new understanding of Appalachian communities and their relationship to American industrial development. But it would also establish the reputation that would protect the Telungi territories from future intrusion by outside authorities who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to challenge and some communities were too sophisticated to underestimate. The mountains had kept their secrets for centuries, but Crawford's encounter with the Telungi had revealed that those secrets included capabilities that could challenge American industrial expansion whenever traditional communities chose to defend territories that had sustained them, since long before corporate contracts and government authority had claimed dominion over lands that belonged to people whose knowledge exceeded anything mainstream civilization had achieved. The Telungi had taught Crawford the difference between legal rights and traditional authority, but they'd also demonstrated that some lessons could only be learned by people who were wise enough to respect teachers whose capabilities exceeded anything corporate planning could anticipate or government force could overcome. In the end, the mountain darkness had swallowed Crawford's logging operation, but it had also revealed light in the form of knowledge that would illuminate new possibilities for community development and environmental stewardship throughout regions where traditional wisdom had been preserved by people who understood that some things were more valuable than industrial profit, and some communities were too important to sacrifice for corporate efficiency. The Telungi had vanished back into their hidden settlements, but their lesson would resonate through American development for generations. That progress measured in human terms rather than corporate profits might require learning from communities that had already achieved what mainstream civilization was still struggling to understand.